Listen carefully, because this moment was never meant to be heard out loud. A man stood at a podium, drenched in applause, wrapped in medals, certainty, and legacy. He said the words every powerful man says when the story is supposed to end cleanly, and my youngest, who is here tonight. Then a voice cut through the room like a blade through silk. Sir, her name is already on the plaque. Silence followed. Not the polite kind, the dangerous kind, the kind that exposes fractures in the architecture of power. Because that sentence didn't just interrupt a ceremony, it cracked open a system that survives by deciding who gets to be seen and who must remain invisible. History teaches you that recognition is a reward, that medals are earned, that truth eventually rises. That is a lie designed to keep you obedient. In reality, institutions do not reward merit. They reward alignment. They reward obedience. They reward those who follow the approved path without deviation. And when someone succeeds outside that path, when they win without permission, the system doesn't attack them, it erases them. That bronze plaque on the wall wasn't just a list of names, it was a ledger of acceptable reality, and her name was there long before her father ever looked up, long before the applause, long before the narrative allowed it. This is how dark history actually works, not with dramatic executions or public trials, but with omission, with silence, with families trained to look past what threatens their internal hierarchy, with institutions that smile while burying truths in plain sight. You're taught to chase validation, to wait your turn, to believe that if you work hard enough someone will notice. But power doesn't notice. Power filters. And the most dangerous people to any system are not rebels. They're the competent who refuse to beg for recognition. What you're hearing isn't just a story about a family or a ceremony. It's a blueprint, a pattern repeated in militaries, corporations, religions, and governments for thousands of years. Those who don't fit the myth are quietly rewritten out of it. And here's the part most men never realize until it's too late. If you rely on the system to name you, you will always be small inside it. This knowledge is uncomfortable, for a reason. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. To understand why that silence mattered, you have to understand how power trains families the same way it trains institutions. Loyalty first, image second, truth last. From ancient dynasties to modern command structures, bloodlines are not about love, they are about continuity, about control, about making sure the story survives even if reality doesn't. In Rome, sons were paraded, daughters married off, and inconvenient achievers erased from inscriptions. In medieval courts, brothers vanished into monasteries, sisters into silence, and the official record remained clean. Today the architecture is more polite, more civilized, but the mechanism is identical. You are valued not for what you do, but for how well your existence reinforces the myth. The myth here was simple. One son, one path, one legacy, clean, explainable, applaudable. Anything outside that shape became a threat, not because it failed, but because it succeeded differently. Systems hate asymmetry. Families built inside systems hate it even more. That's why the most powerful form of control is not punishment, it's dismissal. That's nice, honey. Those 3 words have buried more truth than any secret prison ever could. They teach you something critical. Your achievements only exist if someone with authority decides they do. Dark history is filled with people who learned this lesson early. Generals whose victories were credited to kings. Inventors whose names were replaced by corporations. Strategists whose ideas built empires while they themselves remained footnotes. Not because they weren't exceptional, but because acknowledging them would disrupt the hierarchy, and hierarchies defend themselves instinctively. The plaque on that wall wasn't hidden, it wasn't locked away. It was displayed openly, confidently, because true power doesn't fear discovery. It counts on indifference, on trained blindness, on people never bothering to read what contradicts their assumptions. This is psychological control at its most elegant. You don't need to lie if you can condition people not to look. You don't need violence if you can teach silence. You don't need chains if you can convince someone their worth depends on approval that will never come. Men are especially vulnerable to this trap. You're taught to earn respect, to wait to be chosen, to climb ladders someone else built. But dark history whispers a different truth. The ladder is a leash, and the moment you climb outside it, The system will pretend you don't exist until it's forced to see you. That interruption, her name is already on the plaque, wasn't defiance. It was reality colliding with a narrative that could no longer contain it. And when that happens, the system doesn't collapse. It reveals itself. There's a reason moments like this feel violent even when no one raises their voice. Because what's actually being threatened isn't pride, it's order. Order is the god of every institution, and order must be protected at all costs. When truth disrupts order, truth becomes the enemy. Understand this: systems do not collapse when they are wrong. They collapse when their authority to define reality is challenged. For years, everyone in that room had been participating in a quiet agreement, a shared hallucination. The father was the standard, the son was the successor, the daughter was background noise, logistics, paperwork, an acceptable blur, not because facts supported it but because everyone benefited from the simplicity. This is how psychological control actually functions, not through force but through convenience. It's easier to accept a story than interrogate it, easier to applaud than to question, easier to keep the hierarchy intact than to admit it failed to see something dangerous. Dangerous competence. Throughout forbidden history, the most threatening individuals were never the loud rebels. They were the silent operators. The ones who didn't demand attention. The ones who didn't need permission. The ones who mastered the system so thoroughly that they no longer depended on it. Empires fear those people. Families fear them too. That plaque wasn't just evidence of achievement, it was evidence of independence. It proved that someone could rise, lead, and dominate within the same machine, without begging the gatekeepers for validation. And that exposes the lie at the center of every hierarchy, that approval equals worth. Notice what happened psychologically in that room. Faces didn't show anger first, they showed confusion. Because confusion is what happens when a control narrative breaks. When the internal map no longer matches the territory. When a man realizes the story he's told himself for decades is incomplete, and worse, self-serving. Dark history is filled with these moments, though most are quietly erased. A forgotten general, a deleted report, a renamed operation. Institutions clean up after themselves the way predators clean bones, thoroughly, without emotion. But occasionally something slips through. A name on a wall, a record that wasn't buried deeply enough, a witness who speaks when they weren't supposed to. And when that happens, you see the truth most men never hear. Power does not reward honesty. It tolerates it only when it can't be denied. This is why dangerous knowledge is always revealed accidentally, never through official channels, never during planned speeches. It arrives as an interruption, an error, a glitch in the performance. Remember this: if your value depends on someone else announcing it, you are already controlled. The most powerful position is the one that exists whether the room acknowledges it or not. Now look deeper, past the family, past the uniforms, past the ceremony, and you'll see the machinery underneath. This wasn't just a personal reckoning, it was a ritual failure, and rituals matter more to power than truth ever will. Every institution runs on ritual: titles, ceremonies, rankings, applause at the right moments, silence at the wrong ones. These rituals don't exist to celebrate achievement, they exist to define reality. They tell everyone in the room who matters, who leads, who follows, and who should never disrupt the flow. That night, the ritual broke. The father was meant to stand as proof that the system works. Long service rewarded, legacy continued, order preserved. The son was meant to represent the future, safe, predictable, explainable. And the daughter was meant to be a footnote, a polite mention, a tolerated anomaly that never challenged the structure. But dark history teaches us something brutal. When rituals fail, power panics, not outwardly but internally. It scrambles to regain narrative control, because once people see a crack, they start looking for others. Think about how many times this has happened before, just why? Without witnesses. A general discovering a subordinate outperformed him. A CEO learning the real architect of success was never credited. A king realizing the wrong heir held the real power. In most cases, those moments are handled quietly, records adjusted, people reassigned, conversations buried. What made this moment dangerous was timing, public space, Too many eyes, too many minds updating their internal models at once. That is every institution's nightmare. You're told that secrecy is about hiding information. That's childish. Real secrecy is about shaping perception, letting people see just enough to keep them compliant, never enough to make them independent. And independence, real independence, is the one thing no hierarchy can tolerate for long. The plaque had always been there. That's the part that should disturb you. The truth wasn't hidden, it was simply irrelevant, until it wasn't. Until someone pointed at it, until attention shifted, until silence became impossible. This is how suppressed truths survive, not in darkness, but in plain sight, waiting for the moment when denial costs more than acknowledgement. And notice something else: she didn't announce herself, she didn't interrupt, she didn't demand recognition. That's critical, because the most dangerous individuals are the ones who don't need to prove anything. Their existence alone destabilizes the hierarchy. Men who understand this stop performing for rooms that were never built for them. They stop begging for titles. They stop waiting for applause. They operate regardless. Because once you see how rituals manufacture reality, you realize something unsettling. You don't need permission to be powerful. You only need to stop needing to be seen. This is the point where most stories would offer resolution, an apology, a reconciliation, a lesson wrapped in comfort. But dark history doesn't work that way. Why? It sharpens the knife right here, when awareness begins to hurt. Because the real revelation isn't that she was powerful, it's that she never needed them to know. That detail should unsettle you. All your life, you've been trained to announce yourself, to signal value, to chase visibility, to believe that being seen is the same as being strong. That belief is one of the oldest control systems ever built. Pharaohs used it, emperors refined it, corporations perfected it, social platforms monetize it. Attention is the leash. The moment you crave recognition, you surrender leverage. You become predictable, manageable, rewardable, punishable. This is why the most effective operators in forbidden history learned to move in silence. Priests who shaped doctrine without titles, advisors who ruled kings without crowns, generals whose names never entered textbooks but whose decisions redirected wars. The system praises ambition because ambition is loud, but it fears quiet mastery. In that hall, power shifted without a word being spoken. Not because a secret was revealed, but because everyone realized they had been blind by choice, and that realization infects a room. Men start questioning what else they've missed, who else they underestimated, whether the hierarchy they trusted actually understands reality at all. This is where institutions usually respond with suppression, with damage control, with narrative repair, with whispered explanations and strategic forgetfulness. By tomorrow, there would be a new story circulating, a softer version, one that restores order. But something irreversible already happened inside the minds of those who witnessed it. Now, this is where I pull you in, not as a viewer, but as a participant. If you understand what's being revealed here, if you recognize the power of being underestimated, if you feel that shift happening inside you, Rig. HT now. Comment this phrase twice below. I move in silence. Again, I move in silence. This isn't engagement, it's alignment. It marks the moment you stop performing and start positioning. Algorithms notice patterns, but more importantly, your mind does. Because once a man accepts that recognition is optional, something dangerous happens. He stops asking for permission. He stops explaining himself. He stops wasting energy proving what will eventually reveal itself anyway. The system counts on you wanting applause. It does not know what to do with you when you dawn. And from this point forward, the descent only gets deeper. Once the illusion breaks, there's no clean way back. That's the part no one warns you about. Awareness doesn't feel like victory, it feels like exile. Because when you finally see how power really operates, you realize how many rooms you were never meant to belong to. This is where most men hesitate. They sense the truth, but they cling to the old bargains, the hope that if they just explain themselves better, perform harder, align more visibly, the system will finally reward them. Dark history is littered with men who died in that hesitation, brilliant, capable, forgotten. Here's the forbidden truth: systems don't upgrade you once you outgrow them. They try to contain you. That's why ancient orders enforced vows of silence, why intelligence agencies compartmentalize information, why priesthoods controlled literacy. Knowledge doesn't threaten power until it creates self-directed men who no longer need scripts, men who no longer need approval to act. Look again at what happened in that hall. The revelation didn't elevate her socially, it isolated her. The moment the truth surfaced, the room didn't lean in, it recoiled, because her existence exposed everyone else's dependence on the narrative. This is what happens when you step beyond psychological control. You don't get celebrated, you get reclassified. In corporate history, they call this not a cultural fit. In military history, they call it difficult to manage. In political history, they call it unstable. Different labels. Same function. Control systems survive by rewarding predictability. The moment you become self-contained, when your identity no longer requires external validation, you become unpredictable. And unpredictability terrifies hierarchies more than rebellion ever could. Rebels can be crushed. Independent men have to be understood. And most systems are not intelligent enough for that. So they do the only thing they can. They minimize. They redirect. They pretend the anomaly never mattered. Tomorrow, the ceremony will be remembered for the award, not the fracture. The story will be smoothed. The lesson buried. But you don't bury lessons like this inside a man who's ready. Because now you know something most people never learn. Power doesn't announce itself, it reveals itself accidentally. And once you understand that, you stop chasing stages. You stop waiting for introductions. You stop defining yourself by titles that can be taken away. You start building in places no one is watching. This is the dangerous phase, the quiet phase, the phase where you no longer need to be right, only effective. Where you realize that the most secure position is not at the top of the hierarchy, but outside its line of sight. And from here on, every truth gets sharper. Here is where dark history turns inward. Because once you understand the system, the real confrontation isn't with institutions, it's with yourself. Every control structure leaves a residue inside the men who grow up under it. A reflex to explain. A hunger to be acknowledged. A quiet fear that if no one sees you, you don't exist. That fear is not natural. It is installed. Ancient empires understood this well. They didn't just conquer land, they conquered identity. Romans tied honor to public recognition. Medieval churches tied worth to confession and visibility. Modern systems tie value to metrics, titles, and applause. Different masks, same cage. The moment in that hall didn't just expose a lie, it exposed conditioning. Everyone there realized they had been measuring reality through permission, through who was allowed to speak, through whose achievements counted. And once you see that, something uncomfortable emerges. How many of your own limits were never real? How many times did you shrink because no one clapped? How often did you stop because someone above you didn't approve? Dark history isn't just about elites manipulating masses. It's about how thoroughly men learn to self-regulate, to silence themselves before anyone else has to abandon paths that don't come with applause. That daughter didn't win by confrontation. She won by continuation, by proceeding as if validation were irrelevant. By operating on internal authority instead of borrowed status. That is rare, and rarity is threatening. Most men never make it here because this phase feels lonely. When you detach from external recognition, you temporarily lose your audience, and your excuses. There's no one left to blame, no one left to impress, only results. This is why secret orders, shadow advisors, and unseen strategists always separated themselves emotionally from crowds. Not out of arrogance, but out of necessity. Visibility weakens leverage. Emotional dependence corrupts judgment. The system trains you to crave identity through reflection. Who am I in their eyes? What am I allowed to be? But real power asks a different question. Who am I when no one is watching? That's the question that destabilizes civilizations. Because a man who answers it honestly no longer fits cleanly into roles designed for compliance. He stops over-explaining. He stops defending his direction. He stops mistaking noise for progress. And once a man reaches that point, institutions can sense it, not consciously, but instinctively. He becomes harder to categorize, harder to control, harder to predict. This is why dark history doesn't warn you loudly, it whispers. Because the most dangerous transformations happen quietly, internally, without witnesses. If you feel a subtle detachment happening right now, good. That's the old programming loosening. And what comes next is not comfort. It's clarity. Clarity is not gentle. It strips away illusions without asking if you're ready. Once it arrives, you begin to see patterns everywhere. Patterns that were always there, hiding in plain sight. Look back through forbidden history and you'll notice something unsettling. The men who truly shaped outcomes rarely occupied the throne. They stood beside it, behind it, beneath it. Advising, steering, calculating. The visible ruler absorbed praise and blame. The unseen operator controlled direction. This is not accidental. Visibility attracts interference. Power that wants to endure learns to travel light. That ceremony was never about honoring service. It was about reaffirming hierarchy. About reminding everyone where authority supposedly lived. But authority doesn't live where it's announced. It lives where decisions are made without needing applause. Once you understand this, you begin to recognize the traps designed for ambitious men. Promotions that steal your time. Titles that increase exposure but reduce leverage. Recognition that feels like elevation while quietly tightening the leash. The system rewards you just enough to keep you dependent. Dark institutions don't fear failure, they fear autonomy. A man who fails still believes in the system. A man who succeeds independently no longer needs it. That's why independent success is often minimized, delayed, or reframed as luck, timing, or exception. History books are full of exceptions. Those exceptions built the world. In that hall, the truth didn't just embarrass a father. It humiliated an assumption that authority automatically knows where competence resides. And once that assumption cracks, men start asking dangerous questions. Who else is being ignored? What else is misjudged? What else is operating quietly beneath the surface? This is the moment awareness becomes strategy. You stop broadcasting plans. You stop confusing motion with progress. You stop mistaking visibility for influence. Instead, you build quietly. You develop skills that don't need explanation. You form alliances that don't require announcements. You accumulate leverage instead of approval. The system doesn't teach this because it can't survive if too many men adopt it. That's why most people are trained to chase the spotlight, to fight for seats at tables that were never meant to feed them, to confuse being included with being powerful. But the deepest layer of dark history reveals a colder truth. The most secure position is not inside the hierarchy. It's adjacent to it, close enough to understand it, far enough to avoid being owned by it. Once a man accepts this, he becomes invisible in the most dangerous way, underrated, unmonitored, underestimated. And history has always belonged to those men. Because the final illusion isn't that power is hidden. It's that power wants to be seen at all. By now, you should feel it. The shift from fascination to recognition. Because this was never just her story. It was a mirror, angled carefully toward you. Every era has its sanctioned heroes and its invisible architects. The heroes are celebrated, photographed, remembered. The architects remain unnamed, but their fingerprints never fade. Dark history favors the second group because they understand something the first never learns. Legacy is louder than recognition. The moment you stop needing credit, you gain time. The moment you stop needing permission, you gain speed. The moment you stop needing approval, you gain freedom. This is why institutions subtly discourage self-directed men. They drown them in meetings, metrics, and meaningless milestones. They keep them busy but not dangerous. Because a man with clarity and unused capacity is a threat to any structure built on dependency. Think about how often you've been encouraged to network, to be visible, to build a personal brand. None of that is inherently wrong, but it conditions you to equate existence with observation. To believe that if you are not seen, you are failing. Dark history laughs at that idea. The most consequential decisions in history were made in private rooms, through unrecorded conversations, by men whose names never trended, never echoed in ceremonies, never appeared on plaques. They didn't seek immortality. They sought outcome, and outcomes don't clap. That night, when the truth surfaced, no one rushed to correct the system publicly. There was no announcement, no apology, no restructuring. Because institutions don't admit blindness, they quietly adapt, they note anomalies, they mark individuals, they adjust how closely they watch. The real danger wasn't exposure, it was awareness. Once awareness spreads, control weakens. This is why forbidden knowledge is always framed as conspiracy, arrogance, or bitterness. Because if too many men realize they've been chasing reflections instead of substance, entire hierarchies lose their grip. So here's the unspoken lesson, the one buried beneath the plaque, beneath the ceremony, beneath the silence. You don't need to be included to be effective. You don't need to be acknowledged to be influential. You don't need to be celebrated to matter. The world is not run by those who are praised. It is run by those who are prepared. Prepared men don't rush. Prepared men don't announce. Prepared men don't explain. They wait, they build, they position themselves where leverage naturally accumulates, where systems eventually come looking for them, not the other way around. And when that moment arrives, recognition becomes irrelevant. Because by then the outcome is already decided. This is where the descent ends, not with resolution but with a choice. Most men who hear this will nod, feel a surge of recognition, then return to the same bay. Aviers tomorrow, seeking validation, explaining themselves, waiting to be chosen. The system survives because awareness alone is not enough. Action is rare. Dark history doesn't change men by inspiring them. It changes men by isolating them from illusions they can no longer tolerate. That night nothing exploded. No one was arrested, no titles were revoked. And yet, something irreversible happened. A hierarchy was exposed as incomplete, a narrative lost authority. A man learned, too late, that power does not always announce itself in familiar forms. That is how truth actually enters the world, quietly, awkwardly. In moments no one prepared for. The plaque remained on the wall, it always would. Because systems can tolerate truth as long as it doesn't spread. As long as men continue to believe that recognition equals reality. As long as most people keep performing instead of positioning. But you've crossed a threshold now. If you truly understand what was revealed, you will notice subtle changes in yourself. Less urgency to speak, less interest in being seen, more focus on leverage, skill, timing. You'll begin to sense when rooms are performances instead of power centers. You'll stop mistaking noise for influence. This is not rebellion. This is detachment. And detachment is the one thing psychological control cannot survive. Institutions rely on your emotional investment, your need to belong, your fear of exclusion. The moment you outgrow those needs, you become difficult to manipulate, harder to motivate with empty rewards, harder to threaten with silence. That is why this knowledge is never taught directly. It dismantles too many incentives, too many illusions, too many carefully managed identities. So here is the final truth, one that dark history only ever whispers. The most powerful men are not fighting the system. They are no longer defined by it. They move quietly. They build privately. They act when outcomes are inevitable. And by the time the world notices them, the story is already over. If this changed how you see power, even slightly, then you were ready to hear it.